I still remember the exact moment I realized something was wrong, and it wasn't the noise, it wasn't the construction, it was the water moving where it was not supposed to move. My name is Daniel Carter, and I own 43 acres of waterfront land on the edge of Cedar Hollow Lake in the state of Oregon, land that has been in my family for 2 generations, land with documented water rights that go back to county registration records most people have never even seen. That morning started like any other inspection day, quiet wind across the shoreline, the smell of wet pine drifting in from the tree lean, and the low hum of maintenance work from my private dock. I had been checking the western boundary markers when I noticed something reflecting differently across the waterline, something too structured, too artificial to belong in a natural lake system. At first I thought it was temporary construction equipment, maybe a misfiled county project, but as I walked closer along the shoreline gravel path, the sound changed, a steady mechanical pulse that did not belong to any irrigation system I had ever authorized. That is when I saw it clearly. A fully developed water park structure extending across what used to be an untouched inlet of my property. Slides, pumping stations, reinforced water channels, and artificial pools had been installed directly into the terrain, integrated into the land as if they had always been there. The air around the area carried the sharp scent of industrial filtration systems running at full capacity, and for a moment I just stood there trying to reconcile what I was seeing with every legal map I had ever reviewed. Nothing about this matched my records. No permits, no notification, no boundary agreement. Just infrastructure placed where nature and law said it should not exist. I followed the edge of the construction slowly, my boots pressing into the damp gravel, noticing how the water itself had been redirected through newly installed channels that cut into the shoreline like permanent scars in the land. Every step I took revealed more layers of modification, each one more deliberate than the last, as if someone had treated my property as a blank canvas rather than protected land under legal jurisdiction. I checked my phone and pulled up the official land registry again, confirming what I already knew but did not want to accept. The entire section where the water park now stood was clearly marked under private ownership with restricted development rights tied to environmental water flow protection statutes. That meant none of this could have been approved through legal channels. As I stood there reviewing the data, I heard movement behind me, footsteps approaching with the confidence of someone who believed they had already won the space they were standing on. I turned slightly and saw the first representatives of Willow Bay Community Development Authority walking toward the structure, clipboard in hand, pointing at the installations as if they were inspecting their own approved project. And at that exact moment, I realized this was not a misunderstanding or a clerical error. This was a claim being enforced without permission, and someone had decided my land was negotiable. I stayed still, watching them move through the construction zone like it belonged to them, while the water continued to flow through systems that had never been approved, and I knew I would have to decide very soon whether this was going to become a paperwork correction or something far more serious in the eyes of the law. The moment I saw the representatives walking through my property like it had been pre-approved in their own internal system, I knew this was not going to stay a simple land dispute. It was already turning into a structured claim against something that had never been offered for negotiation. I remained near the edge of the construction zone, close enough to observe, but far enough to avoid stepping into what looked like an actively managed work site, even though no legal record in my possession authorized any of it. The sound of the water pumps was louder now, a steady engineered rhythm pushing lake water through reinforced channels that cut across terrain I had maintained as protected land for years. I checked my phone again, pulling up the county zoning records and water rights documentation, scanning through every layer of legal classification tied to Cedar Hollow Lake. Nothing had changed in the official system. My ownership was still clear, my restrictions on development still active, and no modification requests had ever been filed under my name or any authorized representative. Yet what stood in front of me was not temporary. It was fully operational infrastructure, integrated into the shoreline with the kind of permanence that suggested long-term planning, not spontaneous construction. One of the representatives finally noticed me and paused, holding a clipboard with printed documents that I could not read from my position, but the way he spoke to the others made it clear they believed they were on approved ground. I took a few steps forward along the gravel edge, careful not to disturb anything, and asked for clarification about permits and land authorization. The response I received was not defensive, but procedural, as if the question itself was already accounted for in their internal process. They referenced community expansion approvals tied to Willow Bay Estates, stating that the project was classified under shared recreational infrastructure development. I remember the exact moment my attention locked onto that phrase, because it did not exist anywhere in my property records or county water management guidelines. Shared recreational infrastructure development was not a legal category that overrode private ownership, yet they were treating it as if it did. As I continued listening, I observed more details that confirmed this was not an isolated misunderstanding. Survey markers had been placed at consistent intervals along the shoreline, and the water flow system was already calibrated to distribute pressure across multiple artificial channels, suggesting engineering work had been planned in advance of any visible approval process. I stepped back slightly, looking across the entire installation, and noticed additional personnel near the central filtration unit adjusting controls with practiced efficiency, as if they had performed this type of deployment before. That was the point where the situation stopped feeling like trespass and started feeling like systemized assumption of control. I opened my legal contact list and prepared to initiate formal review, but before I could make the call, another document packet arrived through electronic filing notification on my phone, this time listing my property under a disputed recreational zone classification submitted by Willow Bay Community Development Authority. I stared at the screen for a long moment because I had never authorized any transfer, dispute, or zoning modification request. The submission had been made without my consent, yet it was already being processed through administrative channels as if legitimacy could be created through repetition alone. I looked up again at the water park structure, hearing the constant mechanical flow of pumps and filtration systems embedded into my land, and understood that what I was facing was no longer about physical construction. It was about whether documentation or assumption would define ownership first, and I knew I would have to respond before that question was answered for me. I stood there longer than I should have, watching the system that had been built on my land operate as if it had always belonged there, and the more I observed, the clearer the structure behind it became. This was not a single unauthorized construction project. It was a coordinated claim layered across engineering, administrative filing, and assumed jurisdiction. My name is Daniel Carter, and I have spent most of my professional life working through property records, land use documentation, and water rights statutes across Oregon counties, which is exactly why what I was seeing could not be explained away as confusion. I walked slowly along the outer edge of the water park installation, keeping my eyes on the junction points where the artificial channels connected into the natural lake flow, noticing how precisely the system had been calibrated to redirect water pressure without visible disruption to the surrounding terrain. That level of integration required planning, approvals, and inspections that I had never been notified of, and I knew from experience that no county authority would allow a system like this to bypass landowner verification. Yet the submission I had just received on my phone told a different story, one where Willow Bay Community Development Authority had already classified my property as a shared recreational zone, a designation that did not exist in any official registry I had ever signed or acknowledged. I contacted my legal representative immediately while still on site, describing the situation in exact terms, including the infrastructure placement, the water diversion system, and the administrative filing that appeared to override my ownership classification. While I was speaking, I noticed more personnel moving near the central filtration hub, adjusting control panels and confirming system output levels as if they were performing routine maintenance rather than operating on disputed land. That detail mattered more than anything else, because it meant they believed their authority was already validated. I stopped near one of the reinforced viewing platforms and looked across the entire structure, noticing how the artificial pools had been positioned to maximize water circulation efficiency, feeding into a closed-loop system that extended beneath sections of my property I had never approved for excavation. The engineering precision suggested this was not a last-minute construction effort, but a phased deployment, likely executed in stages to avoid immediate detection through standard satellite or county inspection cycles. My legal representative finally responded, confirming that no formal zoning approval or water rights transfer had been recorded under my parcel identification number, and that the filing I had received appeared to be an administrative override attempt pending verification. That phrase stood out because it implied someone was trying to create legitimacy through procedural assumption rather than legal authority. I ended the call and remained still for a moment, listening to the constant mechanical sound of pumps circulating lake water through systems embedded directly into my land. The presence of survey markers along the perimeter confirmed that boundary interpretation was already being tested physically, not just administratively. I began documenting everything with time-stamped photos and video logs, ensuring every visible component of the installation was recorded against my property map. As I did, another notification arrived, this time indicating that a formal dispute hearing request had been submitted on behalf of Willow Bay Estates, challenging my ownership status over the very section of land I was standing on. I looked up from my phone and back at the water park structure, realizing that what I was facing was no longer a question of trespass or misunderstanding, but a structured attempt to redefine ownership through procedural momentum, and I knew that if I did not respond with equal legal force, the system being built in front of me would continue operating as if it had always been lawful. I did not move for several seconds after the latest filing notification arrived, because at that point the pattern was no longer evolving randomly. It was tightening into a single coordinated legal structure aimed directly at redefining my property rights through administrative pressure. My name is Daniel Carter, and I have handled enough land disputes in Oregon to recognize when a disagreement becomes a formal attempt at jurisdictional substitution, where documentation is used not to reflect ownership, but to override it. Standing at the edge of the artificial water park built across my land, I could hear the continuous mechanical hum of filtration systems running beneath the surface, a steady engineered rhythm that no natural lake environment should ever produce at that scale. The latest document I had received confirmed that Willow Bay Community Development Authority had escalated their filing into a formal hearing request, now asserting that my parcel was under contested recreational classification pending community review. That wording was not just incorrect, it was structurally impossible under existing county land registry codes, which required verified owner consent before any zoning reinterpretation could be accepted for processing. Yet here it was, already circulating through administrative channels, as if procedural repetition could generate legitimacy on its own. I turned slightly and observed more activity near the central water distribution hub of the installation, where personnel were adjusting flow regulators and verifying output consistency across multiple artificial channels that cut through my property. Their behavior was calm, methodical, and confident, which told me they believed the legal framework had already shifted in their favor. That was the most dangerous part of these situations, not the physical construction itself, but the assumption that paperwork could replace ownership. I opened my phone again and reviewed the property deed records for Cedar Hollow Lake, confirming once more that my name was the sole recorded owner of the affected parcel, with no liens, transfers, or zoning modifications authorized at any administrative level. The contradiction between physical reality and legal record was now fully visible in front of me, and I knew that every minute I waited allowed their version of the record to gain procedural momentum in the background. I began recording continuous video documentation, capturing the entire structure from multiple angles, including the intake points where lake water was being redirected into engineered circulation systems embedded within my land. As I moved along the perimeter, I noticed additional survey markers had been placed overnight, extending the claimed operational boundary farther into areas that were clearly designated as protected shoreline under environmental water management statutes. That detail confirmed that this was not a static construction event, but an expanding jurisdictional claim being tested in real time against my silence. I contacted my legal representative again and relayed the escalation, emphasizing that a formal dispute hearing request had been submitted without my authorization or acknowledgement. The response I received was immediate and precise, confirming that no valid hearing schedule could be established without verified owner participation, and that any proceeding initiated without such verification would be flagged for procedural invalidity. I stood still for a moment after the call ended, listening again to the mechanical sound of the water system operating beneath the artificial structures, and I realized the situation had now reached a critical threshold where physical infrastructure, administrative filings, and legal interpretation were all being pushed into direct conflict. At that point, I understood clearly that this was no longer about stopping construction. It was about preventing a false record from becoming accepted reality. And if I did not intervene with immediate legal correction, the system being built on my land would continue advancing as if ownership itself had already been rewritten. I received the formal response just before noon, and I remember staring at the screen longer than I should have, because the language used in the notification was not just procedural, it was definitive in a way that attempted to overwrite the physical reality I was standing in. My name is Daniel Carter, and by that point I had already spent hours documenting every visible component of the water park constructed across my land at Cedar Hollow Lake. But the new filing introduced something far more serious than unauthorized construction. It stated that Willow Bay Community Development Authority had escalated the dispute into a structured jurisdictional hearing process, asserting that my property was under provisional recreational classification pending community validation review. I read that line several times because it contradicted every recorded entry in the county land registry, every environmental restriction notice, and every water rights document tied to my parcel identification number. Yet despite that contradiction, the filing had been accepted into processing channels, which meant the system was now treating a false claim as a pending legal reality until formally corrected. I stood near the shoreline where the artificial water channels cut through my property and listened to the continuous mechanical sound of pumps pushing lake water into engineered circulation loops, each one embedded directly into land that had never been authorized for modification. The personnel operating the system appeared calm and structured, moving between control panels and flow regulators as if they were managing a fully approved municipal installation rather than infrastructure built on contested private ground. That confidence told me everything I needed to know about how far the procedural narrative had already advanced internally. I walked slowly along the perimeter gravel path, keeping my distance from the central filtration system while continuing to record detailed footage of every structural component, including intake valves, reinforced piping, and boundary survey markers that had been placed without my consent. Each marker represented not just physical intrusion, but an attempt to redefine the legal edge of my ownership through visual repetition. I contacted my legal representative again while still on site, reading the filing details directly into the call so there would be no ambiguity in documentation. The response I received was immediate, confirming that no jurisdictional transfer or zoning reclassification could be legally recognized without verified owner authorization and recorded county approval. However, they also warned that once a hearing process had been initiated through administrative channels, even improperly, it would require formal dismissal rather than informal correction, which meant time was now a critical factor. I stopped near the edge of one of the artificial pools and looked across the entire installation, noticing how the water flow had been distributed into multiple segmented basins designed to mimic natural recreational zones, each one carefully integrated into the existing terrain. The engineering precision suggested long-term planning, not temporary occupation, which meant whoever authorized this believed they had already secured a legal foundation for what was physically present. I checked the latest update on my phone and saw that the hearing request had now been assigned a preliminary review date, still without my participation confirmed, which meant the process was advancing on assumption rather. I received the confirmation update just after the afternoon light shifted across Cedar Hollow Lake, and the moment I opened the notification, I understood that the situation had crossed from procedural escalation into active administrative validation pressure. My name is Daniel Carter, and I was still standing on my property near the edge of the water park installation when the legal system update arrived, indicating that Willow Bay Community Development Authority had successfully escalated their hearing request into formal scheduling review, despite the absence of verified owner consent in any part of the filing history. That single update meant the system was no longer treating this as a static dispute, but as a developing jurisdictional case that could begin moving through procedural stages if left unchallenged at the documentation level. I looked across the artificial infrastructure embedded in my land, watching the continuous operation of pumps, filtration lines, and water redistribution channels that had been constructed with a level of precision that suggested long-term operational intent rather than temporary occupation. The sound of the system was steady and mechanical, a constant engineered rhythm that did not belong to the natural environment of the lake, and every second it continued running reinforced the urgency of correcting the legal record before it became normalized through administrative repetition. I opened my secure legal channel while walking slowly along the shoreline boundary, providing my attorney with a full chronological summary of events, including unauthorized construction, unapproved water diversion systems, and the latest procedural escalation attempt initiated through municipal filing systems. The response confirmed that no jurisdictional reassignment could be validated without documented owner authorization and verified county approval, but it also emphasized that once a hearing process entered formal scheduling review, it required immediate procedural counter-filing to prevent default assumption from advancing within the system. That distinction mattered because procedural law does not operate on physical truth alone. It operates on what is recorded and unchallenged within administrative timelines. I stopped near one of the reinforced artificial water channels and observed how the system had been integrated into the terrain with careful alignment, as if designed to appear permanent under casual inspection. Survey markers placed along the perimeter confirmed that the boundary interpretation was still being actively tested, not physically expanded at this moment, but structurally reinforced through documentation attempts. I recorded additional high-resolution footage of the installation, capturing intake valves, distribution nodes, and structural anchoring points that connected directly into sections of land clearly marked as restricted under environmental water protection statutes. Each piece of evidence was time-stamped and logged to ensure that the physical reality of the construction could not be separated from the legal challenge being prepared in parallel. Another notification arrived indicating that the hearing request had been officially accepted into preliminary scheduling queue, pending confirmation of participant validation. That wording indicated a procedural gap had opened where the system was temporarily accepting the existence of a dispute before confirming legitimacy of all parties involved. I recognized that as a critical window, because once a case enters scheduling flow, it begins generating internal references that can influence downstream administrative handling even before full review occurs. I stood still for a moment, listening to the constant mechanical circulation of water through the artificial channels, and realized that the structure in front of me was no longer just physical construction on private land. It was becoming a parallel record attempting to redefine ownership through uninterrupted procedural motion, and if I did not immediately interrupt that motion with formal legal correction, the system itself could begin treating the unauthorized installation as an accepted, operational reality rather than an ongoing violation. I received the escalation notice just after sunrise, and this time the language was no longer procedural in a passive sense. It was structured as if the system itself was preparing for forward movement through administrative channels that I had not authorized or initiated. My name is Daniel Carter, and I was standing at the edge of Cedar Hollow Lake, where the artificial water park infrastructure continued operating across my land, when my legal interface confirmed that the hearing request submitted by Willow Bay Community Development Authority had advanced into active scheduling allocation, meaning the system was now preparing timeline placement for a dispute that should never have reached validation stage without verified ownership confirmation. I stood still for a moment because that single procedural shift changed the entire risk profile of the situation. Once a hearing enters scheduling allocation, it begins generating internal references, cross-linked administrative entries, and preliminary recognition markers that can influence downstream interpretation even before any formal review occurs. That meant every minute of delay now carried measurable legal consequence. I walked along the shoreline boundary again, watching the water park system operate continuously, its pumps maintaining steady circulation through artificial channels embedded into terrain that remained legally registered under my exclusive ownership. The mechanical sound of the filtration units echoed across the lake's surface, blending with natural wind patterns in a way that made the artificial system feel deceptively integrated into the environment, which I realized could be part of the problem if left uncorrected in the legal record. I opened my secure legal communication channel and transmitted a complete escalation packet to my attorney, including time-stamped visual documentation, county registry extracts, and the latest administrative filing received from Willow Bay Community Development Authority. The response confirmed that while the filing itself had no valid jurisdictional foundation, the existence of a scheduled hearing request meant immediate counterfiling was required to prevent procedural default recognition. That distinction was critical because in administrative law, silence is often interpreted as passive acceptance when systems move into structured review phases. I stopped near one of the main distribution nodes of the water system and observed how the infrastructure had been extended into deeper sections of my property, with reinforced piping and regulated flow controls suggesting engineered permanence rather than temporary occupation. Survey markers placed along the perimeter indicated that the claimed operational boundary had been expanded again, not physically enforced through construction at this moment, but documented through positioning that implied future intent. I recorded additional high-resolution footage, ensuring every structural component was captured from multiple angles, including intake valves, pressure regulators, and electrical control hubs that powered the system's continuous operation. Another notification arrived confirming that the hearing had now been assigned a preliminary docket identifier within the administrative tracking system, which meant the case had entered formal procedural visibility across multiple review layers. That detail changed the urgency again, because once docket identification exists, it becomes increasingly difficult to remove erroneous jurisdictional claims without direct legal correction filed within strict timelines. I looked across the entire installation and understood that what I was witnessing was no longer just unauthorized construction, but a procedural race between physical truth and recorded assumption, where whichever version stabilized first within the system would shape how the property was interpreted moving forward. I initiated another legal update, instructing immediate filing of ownership reaffirmation documents and emergency jurisdictional correction request, because at that stage the water park was no longer simply occupying my land. It was being processed by the system as if its existence might be validated unless actively and formally contested at the documentation level without delay. I received the final escalation trigger just before midday, and this time the notification did not feel like another incremental update, but like a structural threshold being crossed within the administrative system itself. My name is Daniel Carter, and I was still standing at Cedar Hollow Lake near the edge of the artificial water park built across my property, when my legal channel confirmed that Willow Bay Community Development Authority's hearing request had moved from preliminary scheduling allocation into active docket confirmation, meaning the system had now assigned formal procedural identity to a dispute that was still fundamentally based on an unauthorized construction claim. I paused when I read that because once a docket becomes active, it is no longer a theoretical review. It becomes a tracked legal event that generates persistent references across multiple administrative layers, and every hour without correction increases the risk of assumed legitimacy being embedded into procedural history. I looked across the shoreline and observed the water park operating at full capacity, pumps circulating lake water through engineered channels, filtration systems maintaining continuous flow, and reinforced basins holding artificial water zones integrated directly into land that remained under my exclusive ownership, according to county registry records. The physical reality in front of me had not changed, but the legal representation of it was now actively shifting inside administrative systems that were beginning to treat the structure as a disputed but potentially valid recreational installation. I opened my legal communication interface immediately and initiated emergency filing protocols, submitting ownership reaffirmation documents, certified land deed records, and water rights verification certificates directly into the jurisdictional correction channel. My attorney confirmed receipt within minutes and emphasized that once a case reaches active docket confirmation, failure to respond with immediate counter-documentation can allow procedural default interpretation to take hold in downstream review stages. I walked slowly along the perimeter of the installation, carefully observing how survey markers had been extended further into my land overnight, creating a visual boundary line that did not match any legal map or environmental zoning classification on record. That discrepancy was no longer just physical trespass. It was becoming a documented alternative boundary narrative that could influence how the system interpreted jurisdiction if left unchallenged. I recorded continuous video evidence again, capturing every visible element of the infrastructure, including intake channels, pump stations, filtration units, and electrical control hubs that regulated water flow across the entire installation. The sound of the system was constant and mechanical, a steady engineered rhythm that reinforced the sense that this was no longer a temporary intrusion, but a functioning operational structure attempting to normalize itself through uninterrupted activity. Another notification arrived confirming that the docket entry had been shared across multiple administrative review departments, meaning the case was now visible beyond initial intake channels and could be referenced in broader jurisdictional assessments. That detail changed the urgency again, because visibility across multiple layers of administrative review increases the probability that incomplete or incorrect filings may be temporarily treated as valid pending correction. I stopped near one of the main water distribution nodes and observed how precisely the system had been engineered into the terrain, with reinforced piping embedded beneath ground level and pressure regulators calibrated for continuous output, suggesting long-term operational planning rather than short-term occupation. At that moment, I understood clearly that this was no longer a question of stopping construction. It was a question of preventing a false jurisdictional record from stabilizing inside the system long enough to influence legal interpretation. And if I did not secure immediate correction across all administrative layers, the structure built on my land could begin to exist not only physically, but procedurally as well. I received the final procedural confirmation at Cedar Hollow Lake just as the afternoon light shifted across the shoreline, and the notification did not feel like another incremental update, but like the closing movement of a system that had been building pressure across every administrative layer involved in the case. My name is Daniel Carter, and I was standing near the edge of my property watching the artificial water park continue operating across land that remained legally registered under my exclusive ownership when the legal interface confirmed that the Willow Bay Community Development Authority hearing docket had been formally escalated into administrative review freeze pending ownership verification, meaning all further procedural movement was now suspended until jurisdictional legitimacy could be confirmed through direct evidence submission. I stood still for a moment because that phrase changed everything, not because it solved the problem, but because it stopped the system from continuing to build a parallel legal reality without challenge. The mechanical sound of the water infrastructure continued behind me, pumps maintaining steady circulation through engineered channels and filtration units embedded directly into the terrain. But now that sound felt different, less like ongoing construction and more like a system temporarily paused between conflicting interpretations of authority. I opened my legal communication channel immediately and confirmed that all ownership reaffirmation documents, certified deed records, and water rights filings had been successfully delivered into the county jurisdiction correction system with priority escalation marking, ensuring that no further administrative processing could proceed without acknowledgement of my claim as primary landholder. My attorney confirmed that the freeze order was significant because it halted any procedural assumption of validity that might have been forming around the contested filing, effectively preventing the docket from advancing into review stages where incomplete claims could gain temporary influence. I walked slowly along the shoreline perimeter again, observing the artificial water park structure with full awareness of how close the system had come to being interpreted as an accepted installation rather than an active dispute. Survey markers placed along the boundary were still visible, but now they carried a different weight, no longer suggesting expansion, but instead serving as evidence points within a frozen jurisdictional record. I recorded additional footage across the entire installation, ensuring that every structural component, including intake valves, reinforced piping networks, distribution hubs, and filtration systems, was documented under continuous time-stamped capture for legal submission continuity. The atmosphere felt quieter even though nothing physically had changed, because the most important shift was no longer in the environment, but in the administrative system that had temporarily stopped accepting forward movement from the opposing claim. Another update arrived confirming that the hearing docket had been placed under mandatory verification review, requiring direct proof of landowner consent before any scheduling could resume, which effectively removed the procedural momentum that had been building over the previous stages. I stopped near the central distribution hub of the water system and looked at the engineered flow of water moving through channels carved into my land, realizing how quickly physical infrastructure can begin to feel permanent when left unchallenged by legal correction. I understood then that the critical phase of the conflict was not the construction itself, but the timing of legal intervention, because once procedural systems stabilize a false claim, reversing that record becomes significantly more complex than preventing its formation in the first place. I remained there for a long moment, listening to the steady mechanical rhythm of the system operating without interruption, and I recognized that while the physical water park still existed in front of me, its legal foundation had been interrupted at the exact point where it mattered most, preventing it from transitioning from contested intrusion into recognized jurisdictional reality.